Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
In May 2025, a single private stock portfolio was worth, well, at most $1 million.
Right.
But then, just 7 months later, right after a massive Pentagon tech deal, that exact same portfolio was sold off for somewhere between $5 and $25 million.
Which is just a staggering return.
Yeah, but the catch here is that the person holding the stock and the government official overseeing that multi-million-dollar Pentagon tech deal were the exact same guy.
Yeah, it's a wild financial windfall. But, more importantly, it exposes this massive structural blind spot in how modern government actually interacts with private tech capital.
Exactly.
The transparency that's supposed to be, the bedrock of public trust, it just kind of vanishes when you introduce private equity into the mix.
And that structural blind spot is exactly our focus today. So welcome to the deep dive. We are exploring a timeline that sits right at this explosive intersection of cutting-edge AI, military power, and, frankly, enormous financial windfalls.
It's a heavy one.
It is. And our source material today is a really detailed investigative report published by The Guardian on April 9th, 2026. The mission for this deep dive for you, the listener, is to unpack the complex, highly compressed timeline of how a top U.S. defense official made millions from private stock in an AI company.
Right, while simultaneously pushing forward major government agreements with that very same firm.
Exactly.
And unraveling this, it requires us to look really closely at the mechanical gears of both Silicon Valley venture capital and the Pentagon's procurement process.
Right.
Because these are two colossal systems that operate on entirely different frequencies, and they collided in a very specific window of time here.
They really did. But before we get into those mechanics, I do need to speak directly to you, the listener, to set a crucial baseline up front.
Yeah, this is important.
Very. This source material contains politically charged content. It involves the Trump administration, Elon Musk, and some deeply debated defense policies. So we want to state unequivocally that we are not taking any political sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints, the actions, or the individuals mentioned in this Guardian report. Our only objective is to impartially convey the facts, the timelines, and the core ideas exactly as they are presented in the original source material.
Right. Our role is strict analysis. We're just mapping out the sequence of events and the underlying mechanisms that allow them to happen. We're not here to litigate the politics surrounding them.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
Because we really need to start with the core event and the raw numbers.
Let's do it.
So the central figure in the Guardian's investigation is Emil Michael. He was sworn in as the Under Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering back in May 2025.
Right.
And the investigation highlights that he recently sold private stock in Elon Musk's AI company, XAI, for a final payout ranging between $5 million and $25 million.
Because government disclosures use those broad ranges rather than exact figures, right?
Yeah, exactly. But even at the low end, we are looking at a gain of 400%. At the high end, it's a 4,800% return in less than a year.
Wow. And to put that in perspective, even in the highly inflated hyper-growth environment of Silicon Valley tech valuations, a return of that magnitude in a 7-month window is extraordinary.
It's unheard of.
It really is. But the financial gain itself is only the symptom here. The mechanism of how he held the asset is where the real complexity begins. Because the report notes he held this stake through an entity called KQ Partners.
Right, so let me try to visualize how that works. It's kind of like, imagine you're the referee of the Super Bowl, but you also secretly own the holding company that manufactures the specific brand of footballs used in the game.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
And that holding company gets a massive bonus every time a team decides to pass instead of run. And on top of all that, nobody in the stadium is allowed to look at your financial records.
That's a pretty apt way to look at it.
Because XAI is a private company, right? It's not publicly traded. So the details of how he acquired the stock, the price he paid, and the identity of the person who ultimately bought it from him, they just remain entirely unknown. So how does a government official manage to hold private, untraceable stock in a company they are actively regulating and negotiating with?
Well, that opacity is basically baked into the architecture of private equity. For the average person trading public stock, like, Apple or Microsoft, the system is fundamentally transparent.
Right. Everybody sees the price.
Exactly. The stock price is public knowledge every millisecond. The market provides instant liquidity. If a government official needs to sell public stock to comply with ethics rules, They just log into a brokerage account, hit sell, and the transaction is matched with an anonymous buyer instantly on the open exchange.
But private equity lacks all of those mechanisms.
Completely.
Because there is no open exchange. Like, you can't just dump shares of XAI on a Tuesday afternoon using a smartphone app.
Precisely. Private stock is highly illiquid. Finding a buyer requires navigating a secondary market, and the transaction is often heavily restricted by the company's own board of directors.
Oh.
Yeah. And then you add KQ Partners to the equation. A holding company operates a bit like a heavily tinted window on a vehicle.
Okay.
The government can look at the car and see that there is an asset inside, but they cannot clearly see the specifics of the asset, how it's behaving, or, who else is in the car with it.
So it's a black box.
Basically. When an official enters public service holding private equity inside a shell entity, the lack of a public market makes the legal process of divesting structurally complicated and completely dark to outside observers.
And the background of the individuals involved adds like another layer of complexity to that tinted window.
Oh, definitely.
Emil Michael didn't just appear out of nowhere. The Guardian points out he was previously an executive, the chief business officer actually at Uber.
Right.
He knows Elon Musk socially. Musk even tweeted his public support for Michael to become the Secretary of Transportation back in 2024.
Yeah, they go way back.
So the pre-existing web of Silicon Valley relationships was already deeply established long before Michael took his oath at the Pentagon.
And those relationships serve as the contextual foundation, sure. But the tension really ratchets up when we look at the specific sequence of dates.
Yeah.
Because the timeline reveals how the slow machinery of government ethics compliance clashed directly with the rapid pace of technology procurement.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because, the financial windfall is massive, but the timeline of that windfall is what actually sparked the investigation.
Let's hear it.
The Guardian lays out a very specific chronological sequence. In July 2025, the Pentagon officially selected xAI's Grok chatbot as one of 4 commercial AI providers.
Okay, so that's step 1.
Right. We then fast forward to December 18th, 2025. On that day, Emil Michael receives a divestiture certificate from the Office of Government Ethics, the OGE.
And that's the formal document telling him he must sell his xAI stock to comply with federal conflict of interest laws, right?
Exactly. Then, just 4 days later, on December 22, the Defense Department publicly announces a massive new agreement to deploy xAI on a military platform called GenAI.mil.
And they were rolling that out to 3 million military and civilian personnel.
Yeah, 3 million. And the final piece of the puzzle, Michael didn't actually finalize the sale of his stock until January 9, 2026.
What's fascinating here is the 96-hour gap between the ethics mandate to sell and the announcement of a massive enterprise-wide deployment contract.
It's crazy.
That 4-day window is the focal point of the entire controversy.
I have to pause on that 96-hour window. I've dealt with basic government bureaucracy. Getting a permit to build a deck takes months.
Oh, yeah.
A massive defense contract deploying unproven artificial intelligence to 3 million personnel does not materialize over a long weekend.
No, it certainly doesn't.
The ink on that GenAI deal had to be drying while he was still officially holding the stock. Did the procurement team just intentionally outrun the ethics lawyers?
You are identifying the exact mechanical failure in the system. The procurement process for an enterprise-wide military deployment involved months of rigorous negotiation, security clearances, software architecture reviews, logistical planning. It's a massive undertaking.
Right, it's not a quick email.
Exactly. What the timeline exposes is the existence of 2 parallel tracks of government bureaucracy operating at completely different speeds.
So the tech side sprinted while the legal side crawled.
Yes. On the first track, you have the procurement side. As Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, Michael's mandate is to evaluate emerging technology, negotiate with vendors, and push for AI integration across the armed forces.
And that track was clearly moving at warp speed, culminating in that December 22 announcement.
Right. And then on the second track, you have the federal compliance process.
Yeah.
Obtaining an OGE divestiture certificate is not a quick rubber stamp.
I'm sure it's not.
It requires deep audits, legal reviews, back and forth negotiations about how to structure the sale without triggering massive tax penalties for the official.
Right.
The timeline proves that the procurement track aggressively outpaced the ethics track.
By a lot.
By a lot. The optics are incredibly damaging because it strongly suggests the massive contract was fundamentally secured, negotiated, and finalized, while the official overseeing the AI push was technically still financially invested in the very company winning the bid.
And that 96-hour gap isn't just a bad look. It fundamentally breaks the legal firewall that ethics watchdogs rely on.
Definitely.
The Guardian brings in Richard Painter, who served as the chief ethics lawyer at the White House under President George W. Bush.
And he didn't hold back.
No, his assessment of the timeline is blunt. He stated that holding AI stock while involved in AI matters has a very high chance of violating the criminal statute. He also described the transactions as pretty weird.
Coming from a seasoned legal expert whose entire career is built on analyzing federal compliance, calling a transaction pretty weird is a significant red flag.
Yeah, that's lawyer speak for this is bad.
Exactly. The federal statute he's referencing is explicitly designed to prevent government officials from participating in official actions that directly or predictably affect their own personal financial interests.
But then we look at the official response from the Pentagon. Defense Department spokesperson Sean Parnell pushed back against the criticism entirely.
Yeah, he completely rejected it.
He stated that the department maintains a rigorous, multi-layered ethics framework. He explicitly claimed that Emil Michael was in full compliance with all ethics laws and regulations and categorized any claims to the contrary as false.
We are looking at a classic bureaucratic standoff over the definition of compliance.
But those two statements can't exist in the same reality. You have a former White House ethics chief pointing to potential criminal violations, and the current Pentagon saying everything is perfectly by the book.
Right.
How does the Defense Department legally justify that gap? Are the ethics rules just broken when it comes to private tech companies?
Well, the rules aren't necessarily broken, but they are being applied to a landscape they were never designed to govern.
Okay, how so?
This tension exposes the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. From the Pentagon's perspective, Emil Michael went through the required administrative motions.
He filed the paperwork.
Right. He disclosed the existence of the asset. He submitted the paperwork to the OGE. He eventually received the divestiture certificate on December 18, and he executed the sale by January 9. If you view that through a very narrow technical lens, the compliance boxes were checked.
They are saying the paperwork was filed, so the law was followed.
Exactly the argument they are making. But Richard Painter is pointing to the underlying criminal statute regarding conflict of interest, which is about the spirit of the law.
Right.
The legal framework isn't merely about whether you eventually managed to sell the conflicting asset. It is about whether you exerted influence, shaped policy, or made decisions during the months you were still holding it.
Oh, wow. Because during those months, the value was probably skyrocketing based on those exact decisions.
Exactly. The OGE protocols were built in an era of public transparency, designed for officials holding shares in massive publicly traded defense contractors like Boeing or Lockheed Martin.
Not shell companies.
Right. When an official holds a black box asset like private equity through a holding company, the ethics framework struggles to keep up. The opacity allows a situation where an official can technically be in the process of complying with the law while simultaneously participating in actions that drive up the value of the asset they are preparing to sell.
To understand why the Defense Department is willing to tolerate this kind of severe ethical friction, I mean, we really have to zoom out.
Yeah, the context is everything here.
Because the Guardian report details a massive culture shift happening inside the Pentagon right now. The Defense Department is undergoing an aggressive rhetorical rebranding. They are now officially referring to themselves as the Department of War.
And that rhetorical shift is profound. Language shapes institutional behavior.
It really does. And the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, is pushing military AI integration with an intensity that borders on fanaticism.
It's intense.
The article describes the halls of the Pentagon being plastered with posters that mimic classic World War II recruitment ads. But instead of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you for the U.S. Army," the posters say, "I want you to use AI." Imagine you are a mid-level procurement officer. You're walking those halls every single day, seeing wartime posters demanding immediate AI adoption. How does that environment mechanically change the day-to-day operations of the people working there?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it changes the psychology of the institution, which in turn alters its mechanics.
Right.
The Department of Defense implies a posture of deterrence, measured caution, and protecting the status quo. Bureaucracy thrives in that environment.
Sure.
But the Department of War implies an active, aggressive posture. It signals to the staff that a conflict is imminent, or already underway in the cyber domain.
It creates a state of emergency.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And a wartime posture radically alters an organization's risk tolerance.
That makes sense.
If the leadership believes the nation is in a technological arms race for survival, the bureaucratic niceties of procurement timelines, extended testing phases, and even the optics of ethics compliance get categorized as peacetime luxuries.
They just throw them out the window.
Basically, the new mandate is simple: acquire the most advanced technology, implement it immediately, and bypass whatever traditional hurdles stand in the way. This psychology perfectly explains the acceleration we saw in that 4-day window. The mission of securing AI superiority overrode the traditional timeline of ethical divestiture.
And the administration is broadcasting this aggressive posture openly.
Oh, very openly.
The Guardian notes that on January 12, which, by the way, is just 3 days after Emil Michael finally finalized the sale of his stock secretary, Hegseth, gave a speech at Elon Musk's Stargate facility in Texas.
Right.
And Emil Michael was sitting right there in the front row. Hegseth gave him a massive public shout-out, referring to him as the single chief technology officer for the entire enterprise of the War Department.
Quite the title.
Yeah. And we also have to look at the financial muscle backing this specific AI push. XAI isn't just Elon Musk working in a garage, you know? The company has billions in funding from major equity firms and the Qatar Investment Authority.
The consolidation of power and capital in that room is immense.
Yeah.
You have the sovereign wealth of foreign nations, the apex of private Silicon Valley venture capital, and the highest levels of U.S. military command, all operating within a very tight, intimate social and professional circle. They are building a unified front.
But that unified front is currently colliding head-on with the broader tech industry, and it is causing incredible public drama.
It's getting messy.
The Guardian details a major public dispute between Emil Michael and a rival AI contractor called Anthropic.
Yes. Anthropic.
Anthropic is widely known in the industry for prioritizing AI safety, ethical guardrails, and strictly controlling how their models can be utilized.
Anthropic's entire corporate identity is basically built around the concept of constitutional AI, ensuring their models do not assist in harmful or illegal acts.
And the report states that Anthropic drew a hard line in the sand. They flat out refused to allow their technology to be used by the military for domestic surveillance or for autonomous killing.
Right.
Now, in a traditional government setting, if a defense contractor refuses a bid based on ethical concerns, a defense official might release a polite, bureaucratic statement expressing disappointment in the failed negotiations. They just move on to the next vendor.
That's the normal protocol.
Right. That is not what Emil Michael did. According to the report, he went on X, the platform owned by Elon Musk, obviously, and posted personal insults targeting the CEO of Anthropic.
Yeah, he called him a liar with a god complex.
This is a sitting U.S. defense official engaging in a public flame war.
It is a severe departure from traditional diplomatic or military decorum. But, I mean, we have to look at the mechanics of why Anthropic's refusal triggered such a hostile response.
So what does this all mean? We know Emil Michael came from the C-suite at Uber, which is a company famous for its ruthless corporate tactics and actively fighting regulators. Are we watching the Silicon Valley move fast and break things culture, directly overriding traditional Pentagon diplomacy?
We're watching a hostile takeover of the procurement culture.
Wow.
For decades, the Pentagon operated on extreme risk mitigation. Silicon Valley operates on disruption, rapid iteration, and frankly, viewing rules as mere suggestions.
Move fast and break things.
Exactly. When you place a former Uber executive in charge of military tech procurement, you import an entirely different operating system. Treat the U.S. military like a ruthless tech startup.
Which explains the hostility toward Anthropic.
Exactly. When viewed through the lens of a wartime tech startup, Anthropic's ethical guardrails aren't just a difference of opinion, they are a mechanical threat to the mission.
I see.
If a military commander needs an AI to make a split-second targeting decision in the field, they cannot afford the software to pause and evaluate the ethical constraints of the prompt.
Right, there's no time for that.
To a Silicon Valley executive prioritizing speed, Anthropic's caution is viewed as a hostile impediment to progress. It is perceived as weakness.
Meanwhile, the company the Pentagon did choose to partner with, XAI, with its Grok chatbot, is already embroiled in controversy over generating sexualized deepfakes and lacking basic safety filters.
Which ironically makes them the preferred partner under this new paradigm.
Wait, really?
Yeah. A company that pushes boundaries, ignores public controversies over deepfakes, and aligns with the aggressive Department of War mentality is viewed as an asset.
That's terrifying.
The public insults on X weren't just a loss of temper by Emil Michael. They were a calculated public signaling of which corporate culture the new War Department is willing to do business with and which cultures will be actively punished.
So they're actively selecting for partners who will move as fast and ruthlessly as they do, regardless of the ethical fallout.
Exactly.
It is a stunning transformation of how the most powerful military in the world acquires its weaponry.
It fundamentally rewrites the relationship between the sovereign state and the private sector. The friction we are seeing is just the sound of that relationship being renegotiated in real time.
That structural reality brings us to the end of our exploration today. We've traced the timeline from a private stock portfolio to a multi-million-dollar windfall, straight through a massive government contract and a public clash of corporate cultures.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, and the core takeaway for you here is vital. This is not just an isolated story about one man's highly profitable venture capital investments or a blip of delayed bureaucratic paperwork at the Office of Government Ethics.
No, not at all.
What we are looking at is a blueprint. It is a blueprint of how the future of global warfare is being actively and rapidly reshaped.
Right.
It's being reshaped by billions of dollars of opaque private equity, by intimate Silicon Valley social connections, and by a federal compliance system that is seemingly unable to track the complex mechanics of modern tech wealth.
And understanding these backroom dynamics, the 4-day windows, the protective shell of holding companies, the deliberate shift to a wartime psychology, that is the ultimate shortcut to being truly well-informed about the reality of global security today.
Exactly. The decisions being made in these specific rooms under these incredibly accelerated conditions will dictate the mechanical reality of how military power is deployed for the next several decades.
Without a doubt.
We started this deep dive talking about a referee who secretly manufactures the footballs used in the game. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over on your own. If the government officials who are legally responsible for regulating, purchasing, and deploying military AI have deep, untraceable financial ties to the private investors building it, who is actually setting the guardrails for the future of autonomous warfare?
That's the real question.
Is it the democratically elected government operating in the light of day with public oversight? Or is it the private equity firms operating behind the tinted windows of holding companies dictating the rules of engagement through the software they sell?
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.